She was 34 years old the winter she buried her husband, and by spring, she had nothing left but a dog, a wagon, and $11 folded into the toe of her boot. The man who cast her out was Josiah Pruitt, the banker who held her family's note, and he did it the way men like him always did, politely, over a desk, with the deed already signed in his own favor. What little she had after the farm was sold to cover the debt was those $11, and with them, she did something the whole town of Wren's Crossing, Vermont, would call the last foolish act of a woman who had lost her mind along with everything else. She bought the old wool mill down by the creek, boarded up and rotting for 15 years, for $9 at auction, because no one else would touch it. Her dog, an aging brindle cattle dog named Duke, was the only one who did not look at her like she'd gone simple. She told herself it was shelter, nothing more. She did not yet know that something had been sealed above her head in that mill for over 20 years, waiting, and that before the leaves turned again, it would not only change her life, it would set right a wrong that had been quietly strangling this town since before she was born. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Verity Ashworth and her faithful dog Duke. If you have ever been underestimated by people who should have known better, tell us where you're from in the comments below, and stay with us to the end. Verity Ashworth had grown up on the north slope above Wren's Crossing, in a low farmhouse that smelled always of lanolin and wood smoke, the daughter of a shepherd named Caleb Marsh, who could read weather in the color of the sky the way other men read newspapers. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, and so it had been Caleb and Verity alone against the mountain winters, and what he taught her because there was no one else to teach it to. She learned to shear a ewe without nicking the skin by the time she was 9. She learned to splint a broken leg, ovine or human, with willow bark and cloth. She learned the particular arithmetic of a hard season, how many bales would carry them through, how much grain could be spared for the dogs, how a family survived on pride when money ran short. Caleb was not a rich man, but he was a proud one, and he spoke often, in his slow unhurried way, of a time before Verity was born, when the shepherd families of the valley had banded together and built something bigger than any of them could manage alone, a proper wool mill down by Miller's Creek, so that Wren's Crossing would never again have to haul its clip 40 miles over the pass to be carted and spun by strangers who took the lion's share of the profit for themselves. He spoke of a man named Ezra Corliss, the mill's founder, with a reverence he rarely showed anyone living. Ezra had been an engineer by training and a dreamer by temperament, and he had convinced 11 shepherd families, Caleb's father among them, to each buy a share in the enterprise, pooling their meager savings to build the looms and the carting machines and the great stone water wheel that still, decades later, sat rusted and still in the creek. For a few golden years, Caleb said, the mill had hummed with purpose, and Wren's Crossing wool had traveled as far as Boston under its own good name. But then came the panic of '73, and half the country's mills folded overnight, and the story Verity always heard was that the Corliss Mill Cooperative had failed along with them, gone under in debt, and been quietly absorbed by the one man in town, with enough hard currency to buy up the wreckage. Elias Pruitt, Josiah's father, who had been the mill's bookkeeper, and by strange convenient fortune, the only shareholder who came out the other side of the panic with his money intact. Caleb never quite believed that story, though he never had proof enough to say so aloud. He would only grow quiet when the mill came up in conversation, and mutter that a bookkeeper who kept the books had a peculiar advantage over shepherds who trusted him to keep them honestly. He died when Verity was 19, of a fever that came on hard in a wet November, and the last thing of value he left her, besides the farm, was a hand-carved wooden ram no bigger than a fist, which he told her, with the strange specific certainty of a dying man, had belonged to Ezra Corliss himself, and which she was to keep safe though he could not tell her why. Verity had never questioned that instruction the way, perhaps, a less loyal daughter might have. Her father was not a man given to sentiment or superstition, and if he asked something of her with his last clear breaths, she understood it to carry a weight beyond the object itself. She kept the little ram on whatever windowsill caught the most morning light, in the farmhouse, and later in her own home with Thomas, dusting it each week without ever quite knowing why it mattered, the way a person tends a grave they visit out of love, rather than obligation. She noticed, over the years, that it was heavier in the hand than its size suggested, dense in a way that seemed unusual for carved pine, but she had put that down to the particular wood Ezra Corliss must have chosen, and thought no more of it. It sat through her wedding to Thomas, through the birth and loss of a single stillborn daughter 3 years into their marriage, that neither of them ever spoke of again, but both carried privately, through Thomas's death, through every hardship after, a small silent witness to a life it would one day help set right. It was 2 years after that, when she met Thomas Ashworth, at a barn dance in the next township, a quiet, broad-shouldered man, who raised sheep the way her father had, with more tenderness than most men would admit to. They married within the year, and it was Thomas who brought Duke into her life, a cattle dog pup with one ear that never stood quite right, culled from a litter because he was thought too small for real herding work. Thomas had disagreed, and had spent a whole spring teaching the pup to move sheep with nothing but a whistle and patience, and by the time Duke was grown he could hold a flock steadier than dogs twice his size. He slept at the foot of their bed every night of their marriage. He was there the morning Thomas didn't wake up, 7 years into it, his heart simply stopping in his sleep at 39 years old, for reasons no doctor in the valley could name, and Verity always said afterward that it was Duke's low, morning howl that told her something was wrong before she herself understood it. In the terrible months after, when grief made even simple chores feel like wading through water, it was Duke who would not let her sit too long in one place, who nosed her out to the barn each morning whether she wanted to go or not, who became, in the truest sense, the last steady thing in her life. She kept the farm going alone for 3 years after that, through sheer stubbornness and her father's old lessons, but a widow's flock is a target for every kind of bad luck, and bad luck found hers. A hard winter took a third of her ewes. The following summer, foot rot took more. She had borrowed against the land to restock, as any shepherd would, and the note she'd signed sat, as nearly every note in the valley did, in the vault of the Wren's Crossing Savings Bank, under the name of its president, Josiah Pruitt. Josiah had inherited both his father's bank and his father's talent for arriving at a debtor's door with a smile and an apology, and papers already drawn up in his favor. He called on Verity himself the week her second payment came due short, sat in her kitchen with his hat in his lap and an expression of practiced sorrow, and told her that the bank simply could not extend further credit to a widow with no husband's labor behind her, no matter how it pained him personally to say so. He used the word personally 3 times in that conversation, and Verity would remember that afterward as the moment she understood exactly how little personal feeling had to do with any of it. She had tried, in the weeks after, everything a proud woman could try short of begging. She had gone to 2 neighboring banks in townships over the pass, only to learn that Josiah Pruitt's letter of recommendation, or the pointed absence of one, had already reached them before she had. She had offered to sell off her remaining flock outright to satisfy the debt in full, and been told, with the same rehearsed regret, that the bank preferred to take the land itself, since livestock prices were, Josiah explained, terribly unpredictable this time of year. She had even swallowed what remained of her pride, and asked whether the note might be extended a single season, just until shearing, and watched him decline with an expression that suggested the request itself had been faintly improper for a woman to make. Within 2 months the farm was posted for sale to cover the debt, the notice nailed to the very fence post her father had set with his own hands 40 years before, and within 4 it belonged to a cousin of Josiah's from over in Rutland, who had somehow secured financing with remarkable speed for a piece of land nobody else in the valley had wanted, at a price so far below its worth that even the county assessor's clerk had raised an eyebrow filing the paperwork. Verity Ashworth left the only home she had ever known with a wagon, a bedroll, her father's carved wooden ram wrapped in a handkerchief, Duke riding beside her on the seat, and $11 to her name. The town watched her go the way towns watch these things, with pity dressed up as concern, and beneath it, in more than a few faces, a flicker of relief that it was her and not them. She did not know yet where she would sleep come winter. She only knew she would not go begging to Josiah Pruitt's cousin for a roof, and she would not leave the valley her father and her husband were buried in, whatever it cost her to stay. The auction notice was tacked to the post office door on a gray morning in early May, water-stained and half-torn, announcing the sale of certain derelict mill property on Miller's Creek, sold as is, no warranty of condition, to settle back taxes the town itself had finally tired of chasing. Verity read it twice, standing in the mud, with Duke sitting patient at her heel, and felt something in her chest she hadn't felt since Thomas died. Not hope exactly, but its rougher cousin, a kind of desperate practical calculation. The old Corliss mill had stood boarded and silent by the creek for as long as she could remember, its great stone wheel locked in rust, its windows blind with grime, a place children dared each other to run past after dark. But it had 4 solid walls, and a roof that had somehow held against 15 Vermont winters, and it sat on land nobody wanted enough to fight her for it. The auction itself was a small, almost embarrassed affair, held on the mill's own sagging porch with perhaps a dozen townsfolk in attendance, most of them there out of curiosity rather than interest. When the auctioneer, a thin nervous man named Otis Gray, called for bids, there was a long uncomfortable silence, broken only by someone's dry laugh from the back of the small crowd. Verity raised her hand, and said $9, which was every cent she had left in the world save for 2, and the silence that followed was worse than the laugh had been. Otis Gray looked at her as though she'd misheard the question. Somewhere behind her, she heard old Mrs. Iverson mutter to her neighbor that the widow Ashworth had finally cracked entire, buying a rotted mill nobody could use for a farm's worth of money she didn't have to spare. Nobody else bid. The gavel came down, and just like that, for $9, Verity Ashworth owned the ruin of the Corliss mill, and the whole of Wren's Crossing considered it confirmation that grief had finally done what hardship alone could not, and broken her good sense entirely. She did not much care what they thought. She had a roof now, however poor, and a dog, and her father's little wooden ram, and that first night she and Duke slept on the mill's dusty ground floor among the silent shapes of long-abandoned looms, wrapped in the same bedroll that had carried her out of her old life, and she told herself firmly that a roof was a roof, and a fresh start was a fresh start, however unlikely its shape. It was Duke who found the first sign that the mill held more than dust and rot. On her second morning there, while Verity swept 2 decades of grime from the floorboards, he would not settle. He paced beneath the exposed rafters of the mill's high loft, whining low in his throat, circling back again and again to one particular corner, where a section of the old roof beam ran unusually thick and square, as though it had been built up rather than simply grown that way. Verity had learned, over 11 years with Thomas and Duke both, never to dismiss the dog's instincts. He had found lost lambs in blizzards other men had given up on, and sniffed out a gas leak in her father's old stove, years before she'd have noticed the smell herself. She climbed the rickety loft ladder, coughing on dust, and ran her hand along the beam Duke would not leave alone, and felt beneath decades of grime a seam that did not belong in solid timber, a hairline crack running the length of a panel, and beneath it, when she pressed, the give of hollow space, where there should have been none. She did not have the tools that day to open it properly, and something in her, call it caution, call it the old habit of a shepherd's daughter, who did not disturb a thing before she understood it, told her to wait, to look first, rather than tear blindly into old wood. But that night, unable to sleep for the strange electric hum of curiosity in her chest, she took down her father's carved wooden ram from where she'd set it on the windowsill, and turned it over in her hands by candlelight, and noticed, for the first time in 15 years of owning it, that its base was not quite flush with itself. She pressed her thumbnail into the seam, and the bottom panel slid free, and inside, folded so small it nearly crumbled at her touch, was a scrap of paper in a careful, engineer's hand she did not recognize but would come to know well. A rough sketch of the mill's loft rafters, with one beam marked, in faded ink, with a single word: Ezra. The mystery deepened faster than she could keep pace with it. In the days that followed, she returned again and again to the marked beam, working loose the panel Duke had first led her to, and Duke himself would not leave her side while she did it, sitting sentinel at the foot of the ladder each time as though standing guard over something he understood mattered more than either of them yet knew. It took the better part of a week, working evenings after her days spent scraping together what living she could from odd mending and wool-carding jobs in town, to fully free the hidden panel from its housing, prying at old dried pegs with a borrowed chisel by lantern light, while dust and decades of cobweb sifted down onto her upturned face. Twice she nearly gave up, certain she was chasing nothing more than an old builder's odd carpentry, and twice it was Duke who kept her at the task, refusing his supper both evenings, until she had climbed back up the ladder to try again, standing at its foot with an insistence she had only ever seen in him once before, the terrible morning Thomas had not woken. When the panel finally came loose, what lay inside was not treasure in the way the word is usually meant, but something Verity would come to understand was worth far more: a cedar strongbox, dry and intact after 20 years sealed away from weather, its iron corners barely rusted in the airless dark of the rafters. Inside it, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and brittle but still whole, she found a leather ledger book, its spine cracked from age rather than use, a stack of 11 paper certificates, each bearing an ornate printed border, and a Shepherd family's name inked in the same careful engineer's hand as the sketch she had found inside her father's ram, and a canvas sack heavier than its size suggested, which, when she loosened its drawstring with trembling fingers, proved to hold silver dollars, 74 of them, cool and dull with age, spilling faintly musical across her palm in the lantern light. The ledger, written in the same careful engineer's hand as the sketch, told a story the town of Wren's Crossing had never been permitted to hear. It was Ezra Corliss's own private accounting, kept separate from the mill's official books, and it recorded in plain, damning arithmetic that the Corliss Mill Cooperative had not, in fact, failed in the panic of '73. It had turned a modest but real profit even through the worst of that year, thanks to Ezra's careful management and a fortunate contract with a Boston wool house that had continued through the crash. The mill's true financial collapse had come after, and it had been engineered, the ledger used that very word, in a hand grown tighter and angrier across its final pages, by the cooperative's own bookkeeper, Elias Pruitt, who had quietly diverted mill funds into a shell partnership of his own for the better part of 2 years, falsified losses in the official books to justify calling in the shareholders' notes, and then, when the 11 founding families could not produce the sudden fictitious debts on demand, bought up their forfeited shares himself at a fraction of their worth. Ezra Corliss had discovered the fraud too late to stop the sale, but not too late to protect the proof of it. He had hidden the true ledger, the original shareholder certificates never legally forfeited under the cooperative's own charter, and the mill's remaining silver reserve, sealed above the rafters, where only someone who tore the mill apart plank by plank might ever find it. And then, the ledger's last entry recorded with a kind of exhausted grief: he had died within the year, his heart broken as much as anything else, before he could bring the truth to light. The last line, dated and signed, read simply that he entrusted what was hidden here to whoever God saw fit to bring back to this mill, in the hope that they would finish what he could not. Verity sat alone in the loft, long after Duke had grown tired of standing watch, and curled at her feet instead, the ledger open on her knees, and understood, with a slow, cold certainty, exactly whose grandfather had committed the fraud recorded in it, and exactly whose granddaughter now sat holding the proof. One of the 11 certificates, brittle with age but perfectly legible, bore the name Caleb Marsh. Word travels fast in a town the size of Wren's Crossing, and it did not take long for Josiah Pruitt to learn that the widow Ashworth was spending her evenings tearing apart the old mill's loft, rather than putting the place to any sensible use. He came to see her himself on a Sunday afternoon, dressed for church, though it was well past service, and stood in the mill's doorway, with the same practiced expression of concern he'd worn in her kitchen the day he'd taken her farm. He told her, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, that the mill's foundation was known to be unsafe, that she'd do better to sell the land back to the bank for a fair price, and spare herself the danger, that he'd hate to see any harm come to a woman already burdened by so much misfortune. Verity, who had spent 3 sleepless nights with Ezra Corliss's ledger memorized nearly word for word, thanked him for his concern, and told him she had no intention of selling. Something shifted behind his eyes then, a flicker of the same coldness she'd seen the day he'd taken her farm, quickly smoothed back over with politeness, and he left with a warning, thinly disguised as friendly advice, that a woman alone ought to be careful about digging up things better left buried. It was not an idle threat. Within the week, the bank called in a small debt Verity had taken on for mending supplies, a debt she'd been current on in every payment, demanding it in full within 10 days on invented grounds of irregularity. A man she did not recognize began loitering near the mill after dark, and twice Duke woke her with sharp warning barks at footsteps in the yard that left bootprints but no other trace by morning. Old Mrs. Iverson, whose late husband had been one of the original 11 shareholders, stopped speaking to her outright in the street, having been told, Verity later learned, that the widow Ashworth was stirring up dangerous trouble that could see the whole town's credit with the bank called into question. The town that had pitied her now largely avoided her, caught between old loyalty to founding families and newer fear of the bank that held most of their own notes. It was, in some ways, the loneliest stretch of the whole ordeal, lonelier even than the months right after Thomas died, because grief at least had drawn neighbors to her door with covered dishes and quiet company, while this drew only shuttered windows and lowered eyes when she passed on the road into town. She began to wonder, in her weaker moments, whether Josiah Pruitt might simply be right, whether a woman with no husband, and no standing, could ever hope to unseat a family that had run the valley's only bank for 2 generations, and whether she ought to take the easier road he kept dangling before her, and simply sell. It was Duke, again, who would not let her rest in that doubt for long, nudging her out to the mill each dawn with the same unbothered insistence he'd always shown, as though the question of whether the fight was winnable had never once occurred to him, only the plain fact that there was a wrong needing righted, and a job still unfinished. But not everyone turned away. Otis Gray, the same nervous auctioneer who'd sold her the mill, came to her one evening after dark, refusing to come inside, and told her in a low urgent voice that his own father had been the cooperative's second bookkeeper decades ago, dismissed suddenly, and without explanation, the very year the mill failed, and had always sworn on his deathbed that the books had been tampered with, though no one had believed a bitter old man's grievance. And it was Duke, in the end, who gave her the last piece of courage she needed, refusing on the night before she meant to confront Josiah Pruitt, to leave the loft at all, lying instead with his head resting protectively across the strongbox, as though he understood, in whatever way dogs understand such things, that what it held mattered more than her safety or his own. Verity brought the ledger, the certificates, and Ezra Corliss's original hidden accounting to the one man in Wren's Crossing, whose integrity even Josiah Pruitt had never managed to compromise. Judge Harlan Weeks, retired from the county bench, but still trusted by every family in the valley for his fairness. She sat in his study with Duke at her feet, and laid the whole of it before him, and watched the old judge's face change as he read, page by page, the careful damning arithmetic of a fraud 20 years buried. He confirmed what she already suspected, that under the cooperative's original charter, which he himself had witnessed as a young lawyer, shares fraudulently called in were never legally forfeited at all, meaning the mill, in the strict eye of the law, had never rightfully passed to Elias Pruitt or his son after him. It had, this whole time, still belonged to the 11 founding families of Wren's Crossing, or their heirs. Judge Weeks called a public hearing at the town hall the following Saturday, and word of what it concerned spread through Wren's Crossing faster than any auction notice ever had, so that by the appointed hour, the hall was fuller than it had been for any town meeting in memory. Josiah Pruitt arrived confident, flanked by his lawyer, clearly expecting to dismiss whatever grievance the widow Ashworth had cooked up as the fanciful ramblings of a grieving woman who'd lost her sense along with her farm. That confidence did not survive the reading of Ezra Corliss's ledger aloud, page by careful page, in Judge Weeks's steady courtroom voice, nor the sight of the original shareholder certificates passed hand to hand, through a crowd that included the very descendants named upon them. Verity watched Josiah's composure crack in slow stages, as neighbor after neighbor recognized a grandfather's or great-uncle's name on paper that proved, beyond any bank's rewritten books, that the mill's true owners had been cheated rather than failed. When Otis Gray stood, unprompted, and told the hall what his own late father had always claimed about the tampered books, the last of the room's doubt went with it. There was no dramatic villain's collapse, no confession wrung by threat, only the quieter, more thorough justice of a community finally seeing clearly what had been hidden from it for 2 decades. Josiah's lawyer rose twice to object to the ledger's admission, arguing it was nothing more than an old man's private scribbling with no legal standing, but Judge Weeks, who had witnessed the cooperative's original charter with his own hand as a young lawyer 40 years before, overruled him both times with a quiet finality that left no room for argument, and read aloud, for the whole hushed hall to hear, the exact clause under which no shareholder's certificate could be lawfully forfeited except by the shareholder's own signed consent that appeared nowhere in Elias Pruitt's own surviving records, because, as the ledger made plain, none had ever been given. Judge Weeks ruled, with the authority the town still granted him though he held no formal office, that the mill and its land reverted under the original charter to the heirs of the 11 founding shareholders, Verity Ashworth's own inheritance among them by right of her father's certificate, and that the 74 silver dollars Ezra Corliss had hidden away would seed a cooperative restoration fund, to be held in trust by the heirs jointly rather than any single family. Josiah Pruitt, facing the near certainty of formal fraud charges his own father's crimes had merely delayed, rather than erased, agreed within the month to a quiet settlement that returned a portion of 2 decades' unearned profits to the fund as well, in exchange for the matter going no further than the county line. A settlement Verity insisted upon not out of mercy for him, but because she had learned from her father that a fair outcome mattered more than a satisfying one, and the town needed its future more than it needed his ruin. She did note, without much sympathy, that the bank's board quietly eased Josiah out of his father's chair within the year, replaced by a cousin of Otis Gray's who insisted, as his very first act, on having the bank's books audited by someone from outside the valley entirely. By autumn, the great stone water wheel at the Corliss Mill turned again, for the first time in 20 years, restored with cooperative funds and cooperative labor, and Wren's Crossing wool traveled once more under its own good name. Men who had not spoken to one another since the panic worked side by side, rebuilding the sluice gate, and Mrs. Iverson herself came, stiff with apology she never quite voiced aloud, to help card the first new bales, standing at a station her late husband's own certificate had once entitled him to. Verity Ashworth, elected without much debate to oversee the restored cooperative alongside Judge Weeks and Otis Gray, found herself in possession not of a fortune, but of something she valued more, a purpose as clear and sturdy as her father's old lessons, and a town that had learned, the hard way, not to mistake a woman's quiet persistence for foolishness. She kept her father's carved wooden ram on the mill office windowsill where anyone could see it, and told its story to every visitor who asked, because Ezra Corliss's patience, across 20 silent years, deserved to be remembered as much as her own. She had a small brass plate fixed beneath the marked rafter beam itself, engraved with nothing more than his name and the years of his life, so that anyone working the loft afterward would know exactly whose quiet faith had made the restoration possible. Duke, gray now at the muzzle but no less watchful, took to sleeping each night in the very loft where he'd first refused to leave her side, as though some part of him understood he'd stood guard over the thing that mattered most, and more than one child in town grew up believing, not entirely wrongly, that the old dog could still hear something the rest of them could not. We began this story with a woman who had lost everything, mocked for spending her last few dollars on a ruin nobody else would touch, and we end it with the same woman restored to purpose not by luck, but by exactly the qualities that had been dismissed as her weakness: her patience, her refusal to look away from an old wrong, and her trust in a dog who saw what she could not yet see herself. The mill Verity Ashworth bought for $9 had never truly been worthless. It had only been waiting, all those silent years, for someone stubborn enough and honest enough to listen to what it was trying to tell her. What looked like her lowest moment was, all along, the beginning of setting something right that had needed setting right for 20 years, and it took a woman everyone had underestimated, and a loyal dog who would not stop pacing beneath one particular beam, to finally do it. Thank you for spending this time with us, and with Verity and Duke's story. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that overlooked things, and overlooked people, often hold more worth than anyone expects. We'd love to know, has someone in your own life ever proven everyone wrong the way Verity did? Tell us in the comments below. Until next time, stay close.